Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Simon Chun. I'm the organizer of today's webinar. Let me take a brief moment to introduce our speakers. And let me first introduce Greg Illich. He's board member of a Korea Policy Institute. And also we have KJ No from Veterans for Peace as to discuss the ongoing insurrection crisis in South Korea. Before I start, I would like to welcome all of you. And this is a very difficult time for Korea, not only for Korea, also many parts of the world. And thank you so much. And I hope that our discussion today shed insight in what's going on in South Korea. And together we can have a solidarity for those Koreans who are fighting to defend their democracy and peace. And the order of today's webinar is going to be as follows. So I will make a brief introduction and followed by Greg Illich's presentation and KJ No. And then let me briefly share my PowerPoint slides. Okay, the title of our webinar is Yoon's Abortive Coup, an assault on Korea's democracy and sovereignty. And also, as you will throughout the webinar, we also have a Korean native speaker, so I will also do some Korean translation. 윤석열의 실패한 쿠데타, 한국 민주주의와 주권에 대한 공격. And this is sponsored by JNC TV. And JNC TV is a US-based internet news media that reports on the Koreans in the United States and also Korean Americans. And this is, in fact, this as one of the, in my view, one of the very unique media that broadcast and report on the Koreans' resistance. And as I mentioned that it's a great honor to have Gregory Illich and KJ No. Gregory is like myself, a board member of Korea Policy Institute, and the KJ No is from Veterans for Peace. And the story is about the light revolution, or the revolution of lights. In Korean, really, 빛의 혁명. The story is how South Koreans stopped Yoon Suk-yeol's attempted coup, as you might know. As you know, on the night of December 14th, 2024, about 2 million Koreans bearing light sticks and candles and beacons formed a luminous sea around the National Assembly to demand the impeachment of Yoon Suk-yeol. With the president now suspended from power and also arrested, what's next for Korea's revolution of lights? And how can the world support South Korea's quest for democracy, peace, and true sovereignty? To give you a brief background of knowledge, Yoon Suk-yeol, as you know, was elected on March 9, 2022, within the narrowest margin, about 0.7%, as 20th president. And 2 years later, because of his failed economic policies and also major failure in foreign policy, he lost his party, ruling far-right People Power Party, lost general election. As you can see, that shows that the series of the problems and the obstacles and the problems the Yoon Suk-yeol faced, culminating in after month and month of people's protest against his policy. Yoon Suk-yeol on December 3rd declared martial law. Now, looking at the martial law, I'll give you again the timeline. As you can see, this one says Yoon's detention. This is a little misleading. This was a little bit outdated, but Yoon's arrest. Martial law was declared December 3rd. Within 6 hours, less than 6 hours, the National Assembly voted to demand lifting of martial law, the pass, and the new Yoon declares end to martial law. And then immediately, 6 opposition parties jointly submitted parliamentary motion to impeach Yoon. To skip some of those key highlights, as you can see that December 14th, series of using the motion to impeach Yoon passed, and he was at the time literally suspended from power. And the next series of timeline, as you can see from here, is that now Yoon has been asked to cooperate with the law, the authorities, for the investigation. And he did repeatedly, more than 3 times, he refused to appear to the investigator. That led to ultimately, after 3 failures, the court issued a warrant to arrest him. And finally, after 2 attempts, Yoon Suk-yeol was finally arrested on January 15th, so becoming the first sitting president to be arrested. So this is the timeline. Let me look at the main theme, message. The idea that I would like us to organize is as follows. Washington, there are a lot of different analysis and stories, interpretation. The one that I want us to think about together today is the role of United States, the role of Washington's policy in the making of the unfolding development that led to Yoon's martial law. So the argument that I want to propose here is that, and also alternative, is that Washington must stop interfering with Korea's sovereignty. And some of the key evidence that I would like to put in front of you, which I will discuss more in detail for my talk, that is as follows. Even after the martial law was lifted, Washington had continued to obstruct, in my view, the way Koreans addressing the impeachment crisis. So December 7th, for instance, Washington vetoes the very first impeachment motion, which had the following language. It says, Yoon ignored geopolitical balance by alienating North Korea, China, Russia, and pursuing an unusual pro-Japanese stance, and increased Korea's isolation harmed its national security. And the story is that this was objected, basically, vetoed by Washington's. And for instance, the US ambassador to South Korea canceled his meeting with opposition parties, and thus language removed. January 5th, 2025, Blinken visits as one of his last and not last visit, South Korea to prevent Yoon's abortive coup from negatively impacting the long-sought trilateral, what I call axis of war, US, Japan, Korea, or Japan, Korea, US, JACUS. On the day that first warrant to arrest suspended Yoon Suk-yeol expired. Now, you can guess why Blinken visited. And I think KJ and also Greg can talk more about it. All of us can talk more about it, how important this trilateral war alliance is to prepare war against China. January 15, 2025, the US pushes ahead with the joint aerial war games with Japan, South Korea. Now, this is, we're talking about just last week, despite the ongoing great insurrection crisis. So now Korea is, the entire country is in a state of really major catastrophe, national crisis. Here, United States decided to go ahead with the US-led war game with Japan and South Korea, which in line with United States for the last 2 years, especially under Yoon Suk-yeol regime, it's about pretty much non-stop war game. January 16th, just a few days ago, Washington interferes. When I hear say that Washington interfered, it doesn't mean that the Washington, the White House, the Washington major security and elite think tank elites establishment interferes with the Special Prosecutor Act drafted in National Assembly, basically that says that Yoon Suk-yeol attempted to provoke war against North Korea. They specifically object to the three language, that is distribution of, mentioning, investigating, distribution of anti-North Korean leaflet, resuming anti-North Korean loudspeakers, and providing lethal weapons, and increasing Korean military involvement in Ukraine war. All these were implemented by Yoon Seok-yeol. And my argument is that this was United States. Yoon Seok-yeol would not have implemented these very specific policies without the knowledge and approval of the United States. So this is the argument that I wanted to propose to you. The United States was either indirectly involved or informed about it. And not only that, moreover, the United States has systematically tried to interfere with the Korean people's attempt to address this serious national crisis, and still, in my view, is right this minute, right now, is doing it. So my argument is, as we listen to from Greg's and KJ know, this idea, the greatest threat to democracy, peace, stability in South Korea is and has been the much touted ironclad US-ROK alliance. And South Korea needs to shake free from US imperial policy and put an end to Washington's shameful policy history of abetting dangerous far-right forces that advance US interests at the cost of independence. Yoon must be held accountable for his insurrectionism, his continuing assault on democracy, and his betrayal of Korean sovereignty in service of Washington's geopolitical ambitions. So this is my brief introduction. It wasn't so brief, my apology. And I'm going to stop my introduction here. And then what I will do is we'll hear from Greg and KJ No. And let me stop my slide. And for Greg, in the promotional poster, I included Greg's excellent, superb analysis, latest op-ed that has proven might be the most detailed analysis of the coup, especially focused on the military side. So I'm still looking forward to Greg's analysis on the op-ed. Hi, Greg.
Thank you, Simone, for that great introduction. And it's a pleasure to be back on the same program with you and KJ, my much respected colleagues. And thank you, Yoon, for hosting us on your JNSC program, which is also much respected, and all the technical work you put into this. So I have a slide presentation I'm called up here at one moment. I will focus on an aspect of South Korea's recent turmoil that Western media have generally ignored. We hear about the brief period of martial law and the recent arrest of President Yoon Seok-yeol. However, one question that does not get asked is, what did Yoon plan to do had he been successful? Well, it may seem like this is a question for speculation, and there's still much we have yet to learn. Enough details have been reported to give us a general picture. As you can see from the quote on this slide, Yoon was quite hostile toward the National Assembly. The opposition Democratic Party holds a majority of seats, and that made it a challenge for Yoon to pass legislation supporting his right-wing program. As he saw it, the solution was to dissolve the National Assembly, starting by shutting it down. We also know that just hours before he declared martial law, Yoon handed a directive to Choi Sang-mok, Minister of Economy and Finance at that time, and now the acting president. The directive ordered Choi to cut off all funds related to the National Assembly and to create a reserve fund and budget for an emergency legislative body. According to that plan, the National Assembly would have been replaced by this new legislative body, whose members would be appointed by the martial law command, not elected by the people. So you would have total military control over society. On this slide, you can see a few excerpts from the martial law decree, which outlawed all political activities. Yoon's military rule would have criminalized dissent, and demonstrators would be subject to arrest and punished according to Article 14 of the Martial Law Act, which specifies prison labor for up to 3 years. As we'll see later in my presentation, there is reason to believe Yoon may have had much harsher penalties in mind. The decree also placed media under military control, banning freedom of expression. The only information the Korean people could have access to would be provided or controlled by the military. Yoon tried to move quickly on imposing censorship. Not long after he declared martial law, the Interior Minister phoned the head of the National Fire Agency to demand that he cut off power and water to several media companies that had been critical of Yoon. That action was beyond the agency's capability. However, if martial law had prevailed, another way would have been found to shut down media as a first step in imposing control. So how does one enforce military rule? Through violence and threats. The architect of martial law planning was No Sang-won, a former Defense Intelligence commander who was dishonorably discharged several years ago for committing sexual assault. Despite No's civilian status, he worked very closely with Defense Minister Kim Yong-hyun on planning martial law. The Defense Minister repeatedly told high-ranking officers that No's orders were his orders, thereby placing the civilian No at the highest level in the military chain of command. So closely did the two work together that No visited Kim's home 22 times since September, including several days leading up to and including the night of the martial law declaration. Investigators have discovered No's notebook in which he had jotted down meeting notes. And we've learned much about martial law plans from this notebook and what Yoon and his co-conspirators had planned for South Korea. In one meeting, No had ordered the commander of the 2nd Armored Brigade, which is stationed close to Seoul, to join agents at a command center on the day of martial law and go into standby mode, ready for action. Martial law planners anticipated that there would be demonstrations, and it appears that the Armored Brigade commander's role would be to send out the tanks to crush resistance. After the National Assembly voted to lift martial law, Yoon tried to organize another go at it. Martial Law Command ordered 3 airborne divisions in the provinces to go into standby mode and prepare to advance on Seoul. Significant firepower was being mobilized to use against an unarmed civilian population. Soldiers from the headquarters intelligence detachment had been training for martial law since September. This special warfare unit was trained to carry out sabotage and assassinations in North Korea in the event of war. And now Yoon wanted to turn this special warfare unit against the domestic population. These are just the details we know so far. How much more military violence Yoon was prepared to unleash against his people remains to be discovered. Far-right social media influenced Yoon and his co-conspirators into believing that the April 10th legislative election last year was marred by fraud, despite a total lack of evidence. One of the aims of martial law was to abduct 30 election officials and torture them into confessing. As you can see in this slide, these are the tools assembled for that purpose, including metal baseball bats and hammers. No was to lead the interrogation effort, and he ordered a baseball bat to be brought into his office for that purpose. In one meeting, No told others, "If we catch and pulverize all the people involved in the fraudulent election, everything that was fraudulent during the election will come out." unquote. And it doesn't take too much imagination looking at this photo to realize what these 30 people would have experienced in order to torture confessions out of them, false confessions. On this slide, you can see another interrogation tool that No's group planned to use. The plastic guide for paper, of course, would be removed. This model they obtained has a blade that is sharp enough to cut 30 sheets of letter-sized paper in a single group. According to the testimony of a colonel who attended a meeting with No, the purpose of this tool was to intimidate captured employees of the National Election Commission. And indeed, it certainly looks intimidating. Martial law planners aim to torture election officials. The question needs to be asked, how many other people would have been tortured under Yoon's martial law regime? We know that Yoon and his co-conspirators had no compunction about inflicting torture on people. There's no reason to assume that they would have drawn the line at 30 victims. Yoon had a list of 14 people he designated as high priority targets, some of whom you see listed here. He was so determined to seize them that 2 separate arrest teams were organized to hunt them down. In addition, the Martial Law Command cast a wider net, and No's notebook reveals the names of what he described as targets for collection. These included politicians, journalists, labor unionists, religious figures, judges, and government workers. These people were identified for detention and handling, including execution by gunshot. So that is another question that needs to be asked. How many people were on Yoon's execution list? And is there any reason to believe that Martial Law Command would stop at these victims? If you're planning to impose martial law and you know there will be resistance, you'll need to prepare to imprison a lot of people. The photo in this slide is the entrance to the Capitol Defense Command. High-profile prisoners were to be held there in an underground bunker, which had capacity for 500 prisoners. A second facility, the Psychological Warfare Building, was designated as a location where prisoners would be interrogated by soldiers from the Headquarters Intelligence Detachment. Large-scale capacity would be needed to house lower-profile prisoners, and efforts were made to plan accordingly. Martial law planning was underway by last March. A few days ago, it was reported in Korean media that the 7th Airborne Brigade had visited several prisons in North Cholla Province last April, asking for blueprints and permission to film in the prisons. It may be inferred that other brigades made the same inquiries in other provinces. At the same time the National Assembly was voting down martial law, Yoon's forces sent a nationwide inquiry to prisons, asking them to report on their capacity. It was 1:01 a.m. then, a highly unusual time to be making such a request, and it's no coincidence that this came while Yoon was trying to organize a second martial law. How many people were destined to be imprisoned can only be guessed at. But given Yoon's blanket denunciations of entire groups of people opposed to him, it would likely have been on a mass scale. Yoon's martial law speech was rather short, yet it's striking how often he used the word eradicate. It was an important objective for Yoon, perhaps the most important. Just what did Yoon mean by that? It is also worth noting that Yoon's overheated terminology is typical of him. He habitually uses terms like anti-state and pro-North when describing progressives, trade unionists, human rights activists, and even many in the Democratic Party. What means did Yoon have in mind to destroy or eliminate a broad swath of Korean society? Short-term imprisonment wouldn't do it. There's no soft interpretation one could put on the word eradicate. The quotes you see on the slide are from the speech Yoon delivered after the National Assembly voted to impeach him. Unfortunately, Yoon has been effective in appealing to his base through such statements. He has managed to transform an issue of the rule of law and its criminality and successfully mobilized his supporters based on tribalism. We started to see the effects already with his surge in the opinion polls and the recent rampage by violent extremists at the district courthouse this past weekend. The struggle for justice faces an increasingly hostile right-wing segment of Yoon's supporters, roused to action. And if the Constitutional Court fails to uphold Yoon's impeachment, he will return to active duty with renewed danger of his imposing military rule. South Korea is not out of danger yet.
Thank you, Greg. It just have such a chilling effect on personally on me. And it just the severity and the gravity of that the radical, most fascistic, violent language of the martial law is truly disturbing. In fact, I think in your op-ed you said that you pointed out it may take obviously month for the Constitutional Court to for the ruling, and you actually speculate that what could in the scenario, there's a scenario where he may return as a president if the Constitutional Court finds it wasn't unconstitutional. So if you come back, would you attempt a second martial law? I think something probably we can discuss during the Q&A. And thank you so much for your excellent analysis and details. And without further ado, let's have a KJ to share his insight on the ongoing insurrection crisis. KJ, are you ready? Would you be ready?
I'm going to talk about South Korea's martial law fiasco, and I call it a legitimation crisis in the imperial vassal state. The key thing that I want to share is first I want to go over the timeline. This is December 3rd, 2024, 10:27 in the evening when everybody's going to sleep. Yoon declares martial law. By 11 o'clock, all entrances have been blocked by the police to the National Assembly building, but still National Assembly members vault over the walls and they manage to fight their way in, and then they barricade themselves. 11:57, the Special Warfare Forces group arrives. There's standoff, there are clashes. By 12:45 p.m., they're smashing windows to enter the National Assembly building. At 12:48 p.m., the National Assembly emergency session commences, and Yoon tells his martial law command to drag out the National Assembly members if you have to shoot them. So once again, and then in the early morning, by 1:02, within 14 minutes, the National Assembly has rescinded, they have lifted martial law. This is the fastest vote in the history of South Korean politics. And then by 4:26 a.m., martial law is officially lifted. The martial law command is disbanded. But notice that this could have happened. A few minutes of difference could have made the difference between South Korea currently being a military dictatorship and having martial law lifted. On the 7th, Yoon apologizes, but the apology is insincere. The National Assembly attempts to impeach him. The impeachment fails. On December 12th, Yoon says he will fight to the end and that his martial law is an act of governance. And then on the 14th, the second impeachment attempt is successful. On December 27th, Han Duck-soo, the acting president, the prime minister, is impeached. The CIO, the Corruption Investigation Organization Office, summons Yoon Suk-yeol 3 times. He refuses all of them. They request a warrant. They attempt an arrest on January 3rd, which fails because Yoon blocks any attempt to arrest with the Capital Defense Command and the Personal Security Services. On January 14th, the first Constitutional Court hearing is adjourned because Yoon is a no-show. On the 15th, 3,000 police mobilize and they manage to successfully arrest Yoon Suk-yeol. And then on the 18th, just yesterday, there was an attack on the Western District Court that issued the arrest warrant, the extended detention for Yoon Suk-yeol. A lot has happened. Just to go over the basics, Yoon declared martial law because he accused the Democratic Party of conducting anti-state activities, collaborating with communists, and that they'd created a legislative dictatorship. When he declared martial law, he banned all political activities, including the National Assembly and all gatherings, and suspended the press. Again, the timeline before December 3rd, of that day of, at 5 p.m., the Special Warfare Forces met, and they were told that there is a situation related to North Korea. At 6:20, the National Police Commissioner met with Yoon and Kim Yong-hyun, the Minister of Defense. He was given a list of people to arrest and told of plans to occupy the National Assembly. And then from 10:17 to 22, there was a brief cabinet meeting. There were no minutes, no notes, no signed documents authorizing martial law. There was no communication to the National Assembly. And then at 10:30, Kim Yong-hyun, Minister of Defense, addressed all military corps commander, telling them that they had to comply with martial law. And then there's a prologue to this. This starts actually in December of 2023. By March, he starts talking of martial law, and there are 10 meetings prior to the declaration. In September, warnings are stated in the National Assembly. And then No Sang-won, who is the former defense counterintelligence commander, meets at the Loteria, and he is planning the martial law in detail. Units that were involved were the Special Warfare Forces and the National Police. It also involved what we call the Chungam faction. These are people who went to high school with Yoon Suk-yeol. They're considered to be kind of a very, very close coterie of collaborators. Most of these people are under arrest at the current moment. There were drone incursions and provocations with North Korea prior to the declaration of martial law. The Western framing has been that, this was a 6-hour martial law declaration, but it affirmed South Korea's democracy, robustness, resilience, institutional maturity. I say that this is like saying that after a survivor fights off an assault, this demonstrates the mature state of rule of law. It's the exact opposite. It's a gaping, terrifying lack of order. What it does is it does affirm the courage of the South Korean people, but I don't think any Koreans are feeling safe. People have said up to the current moment that they are not sleeping. And even after Yoon Suk-yeol was arrested and put into prison, people said, finally, I can sleep. But now it seems that it's still not safe. I highlight that the most terrifying phrase in the Korean language is martial law decree, 비상계엄령. It triggers images, memories, feelings, fear of torture, enforced disappearances, mass graves, arbitrary arrest, deep paralyzing terror, genocide. And we have dates for that: 48, 61, 72, 79, 1980. Legislators were literally sleeping inside the parliament in case Yoon would declare martial law again. So again, it undercuts the assertion that South Korea is a mature, leading democracy, the strongest, most dynamic democracies in the world, champion of democracy for the world. So really, Yoon was put forth as the leader of the global pivot state, championing liberal democracy around the world, of a global alliance of democracies. And just to highlight the hypocrisy of this, Yoon actually addressed the US Congress and said, totalitarian forces may conceal or disguise themselves as defenders of democracy or human rights, and highlighted the importance of the rule of law. Complete and total hypocrisy. And of course, we have to note the reaction of the Western powers to the coup. After martial law was declared, the only statement the Western governments and leaders could say is, we are watching things closely. We are observing events tightly. The relationship is ironclad. Korea is our closest ally. None of them condemned or denounced the coup. In fact, State Department Vedant Patel was asked if the US supported the rescission of martial law and if the US condemned martial law. And he refused to do both. He said, oh, I just, I can't get ahead of the situation. I can't jump to any conclusions. I'm not an expert on South Korean constitutional law. Absolute, complete, and total refusal to condemn, which tells you everything you need to know. Same thing for Jake Sullivan. Jake Sullivan was asked, were you surprised at Yoon's sudden martial law declaration? And instead of saying, yes, of course I was, he said, I was surprised at the declaration and its sudden rescission. What a strange answer. Taiwan, which is a model democracy like South Korea, said, South Korean legislature has been controlled by pro-North Korean forces to protect constitutional freedoms. Yoon Suk-yeol has initiated nationwide martial law. They essentially endorsed South Korea's declaration of martial law, suggesting that the Taiwan DPP Quisling party also had similar intentions. Just to go over the basics, declaring martial law without justification is against the Constitution. It's only reserved for catastrophic national emergencies. Budget disagreement, where your opposition party shaves off 0.3% of your budget, does not justify deploying troops and turning the country into a military dictatorship. And labeling normal political opposition as anti-state subversion speaks to this extraordinary unbalanced mindset that is literally a clone of the military dictatorships of the 70s and 80s. There were plans to kidnap and possibly torture members, as Greg has also pointed out, and there was probably a plan to attribute this to North Korea as a false flag. Troops were sent to the National Election Committee offices, as Greg has pointed out. They brought an ambulance, an empty truck. They seem to have targeted election services, possibly to nullify the National Assembly election. And they were dispatched with blindfolds, zip ties, ice picks, pliers, hammers, baseball bats, but no baseball gloves and no baseballs. That tells you everything you need to know. So anyway, Yoon sought to override the constitutional process, and he sought to use military force. And as I said before, there were plans to drag out the legislators and to shoot them if necessary to prevent quorum. More recent disclosures have shown that the Minister of Defense had ordered missile or artillery attacks into North Korean or into the Northern Limit Line just prior to the declaration of martial law. There were 2 provocative drone incursions into North Korea. The Northern Limit Line, which is a contested sea boundary, 900 shells and missiles were fired into it across June, September, and November, which is extraordinarily provocative. And it's clear that there was an intention to provoke an intra-Korean conflagration to justify the martial law decree. The planning had been done for months. It failed for several reasons. Citizens' rapid response, there was some mishaps, and Yoon is not a military insider. He's actually a draft dodger, which is one of the reasons why the military probably did not feel loyal to him. But Yoon was well known. He was a well-known autocrat. He was creating a republic of prosecutors. He had hounded his opposition, raided his opposition hundreds of times. And we have to ask the question, how did Yoon become touted as a paragon of democratic virtue? How did he become so despotically out of touch? And what made him think he could get away with declaring himself dictator? The answer points all in the same direction. The United States saw that he could do no wrong. He was lionized by the Biden administration every turn. And every time he was persecuting, prosecuting, and smashing every democratic and civil institution in Korea, he received constant stroking from the West, from his masters. And so he was America's minstrel. He was Mr. American Pie. He smashed unions, smashed scientific researchers, SWAT-raided media institutions, opposition party politicians. And when 100,000 hit the streets of Seoul to demand his immediate resignation, the Western media did a complete and total media blackout. Yoon was a bastard, but he was clearly the US bastard, and he was always to be protected, coddled, and valorized. And talk about this no end, the summit of democracies, they touted him as the leader of one of the strongest, most dynamic democracies in the world, its commitment to freedom. You have brought us even closer. You share our commitment to human rights, to the rule of law, etc. And all of this it begs the question. The US support, encouragement, and investment, and their deep ties to Yoon Suk-yeol, they beg the obvious question. What did the US know about this military coup, and when did it know? The Pentagon refuses to comment, but it's impossible for the US not to have known. All previous military coups in the United States have been green-lighted by the United States. This is because the US has de facto control over all military troops in South Korea. The South Korean military reports to the CFC-UNC command, which is a joint command led by the USFK general. And the US maintains wartime operational control, meaning it has operational control over all of South Korean troops anytime it wants. Under those circumstances, it is impossible for the US not to have known about this military coup. Just thinking from the most minimal sense of common sense, South Korean peninsula is so incredibly packed with troops and munitions and radar and armaments that all troop movements have to be reported to and coordinated with the United States and other divisions in order to avoid a friendly fire incident. It is so densely militarized, and it's bristling with troops, arms, surveillance, and weapons on hair trigger alert. And of course, when South Korea sent the Special Warfare Forces to the National Assembly, you have to understand that the Special Warfare Forces are the most tightly integrated forces of any Special Warfare Forces in the world with the US military. It is essentially a single entity. And if you go on the website, you'll see that they have their own language. It's the only theater special operations command in which US and host nation special operations forces are institutionally organized for combined operations, and they essentially train as a single fighting unit. Therefore, it is impossible that you could have 12 Black Hawk helicopters, 240 special warfare forces, kit up completely for warfare late at night without the United States asking, where are you going at this late hour? And it's not like you can be a teenager and say, oh, nowhere. That doesn't cut it. So this is just my point, is the US has a military panopticon over South Korea. The Korean Peninsula is the most densely surveilled place on the planet. Every inch of land and airspace is monitored, and everything is directly reported and coordinated with US command, control, and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So then we have to ask, cui bono, why? Who benefits? What was Yoon's justification for declaring martial law? And the other thing we also have to note is this insurrection has come in phases. First was the insurrection of declaring martial law. The second was Yoon's refusal to submit to judicial processes. And the third is that they've recently smashed their way into Seoul's Western District Courthouse and smashed everything. If it's okay, I'm going to show a brief clip. Simone, are we okay for time?
Yes, maybe a couple of minutes, yes.
You know, I'll pass the clips. I'll just point out that you can go online, look at the Korean clips, and you can see that there's massive destruction committed by rioters who are waving American flags and who are actually wrapped in the American flag. There is one protester who is literally wrapped in the American flags, and they're smashing everything in sight. Clearly, they're looking to lynch the judge who issued the warrant. And then if you watch the AP clip, you see blurred images, no actual acts of violence, just a little bit of fire extinguisher fog, no US flags, and then you see the police chasing them. And so you get a completely different image. You can see that the Western press, especially AP, which determines what the rest of the Western press sees and says, is already deeply into narrative management at this point. So quick recap, Yoon has been elected. There is a strong trend towards narrative management. The US is insisting that the US-Korea alliance is ironclad. There are very, very specific plans, not simply to have a coup, but to trigger war and to blame North Korea and to plan a false flag assassination attempt. And among these, we have found that there've actually been receipts delivered for 170 North Korean uniforms that were built by a South Korean uniform manufacturing company that were delivered to the Defense Intelligence Command. And this jives with the allegations that North Korean uniforms would have been found in order to attribute attacks to North Korea. So the scale of these plans suggests foreknowledge. It's hard to believe that the US could not have known, given the breathtaking audacity and scope of these plans. As I said, it's a joint command led by the USFK four-star general. There were massive military provocations, and there are very, very curious and evasive responses by the US leadership. I also want to draw your attention to an article last January by Carlin and Hecker in 38 North. They said that North Korea was planning to attack South Korea. Why? Carlin and Hecker are deep state insiders, and they said they were planning to attack South Korea because Kim Jong-un was miffed and that they had found diplomacy ineffectual and had run out of options. History suggests that those who have convinced themselves that they have no good options left will take the view that even the most dangerous game is worth the candle. Now, there's something missing here, because short of stopping diplomatic engagement and starting kinetic war, there is a lot of changes and a lot of options that are possible, including continued disengagement. So there is a missing premise here. And I think what Carlin and Hecker were signaling here is that the US and the ROK were preparing to take the war to North Korea. And because of that, North Korea would have no other option to fight back. And that is why they ran out of options. If you add that little premise, then the enthymeme is complete. It makes sense. So this is my hypothesis. The US had the perfect partner and the perfect solution. The US would have been a huge beneficiary if North Korea could be blamed for starting a war. That would give the US OPCON, operational control over South Korean troops. The country would be under martial law, would make any protest or opposition impossible. Then the US would be able to use these troops, send them to Ukraine if necessary, or and that would be pretextually to counterbalance against North Korean troops in Ukraine, of which nobody has been able to find any meaningful proof, or simply use them on the Korean Peninsula to escalate horizontally against Russia and China. And I argue that this fits the historical pattern. The US has always deployed South Korean troops to clean up losing US wars. For example, in Vietnam, the US sent 340,000 troops. They were a larger presence than US forces after 1972. 2-to-1, South Koreans outnumbered US troops. And of course, specifically in the case of Ukraine, South Korean troops are trained in trench warfare, mechanized warfare, attritional warfare, cold weather warfare, and they're interoperable with NATO equipment and communications, and they would have been the perfect antidote to the US losses in Ukraine. And this explains the farcical story of North Korean troops in Kursk. I won't go into that in too much detail, but I'll just point out there are lots of Asians who could be considered, who could be mistaken for Koreans, and there are also Koreans, ethnic Koreans in Russia. And also the video, the Korean person, quote unquote, doesn't sound Korean. Why does he have a fake stolen ID as a Buryat when the Russians could give him all the ID he wanted? And also, it doesn't make any sense because North Korea has no interoperability with Russian military. So all this is to say is the US had to know and would have benefited, and it could also shut down this insurrection within seconds. They could simply tell Yoon to surrender, and they could disavow all the protesters who are waving American flags. But they're not doing that. And I think all of this signals tremendous implication in South Korea's internal politics. And I'll stop right there.
Thank you so much, KJ. That was so comprehensive, and not only you detailed the actual phase of insurrection, martial law, but also the broader implication. And I really, it's well connected to the theme that I hope to shed now. At this point, I think we have a couple of questions here before we look at the participant questions from our friends, participants. I would like to pose maybe just a couple of questions for Greg and AJ. For Greg, do you like maybe one question, and then you can maybe give us your insight. Now, obviously, the Trump administration, Trump inaugurated today, and how the in view of the fact that we, three of us at least, and also the our participant, we have enough strong evidence that U.S. Involvement of the at least with involvement, if it's not direct, but it's indirectly in the ongoing insurrection crisis. Now, how will the United States Trump administration react to this ongoing insurrection crisis? And I know this is a speculative question that is hard, might to answer, or would you predict, or what should Koreans should know about in terms of Koreans, those who are fighting to defend their democracy and still trying to go through this horrible impeachment stage? What do you want to tell the Korean in Korea about as a part of strategizing? Greg, do you have any wisdom or insight? What do you expect from Trump administration?
Yeah, well, it is a speculative question, and which I usually tend to shy away from. But in the best of circumstances, it's hard to predict what Trump will do. But I have noticed in the news that the South Korean People's Party, Power Party, that's Yoon's party, sent several representatives to talk with Trump in Washington. So they're getting their message across. I haven't seen whether the Democratic Party has sent people to get their message across. So I think a lot depends on what messages that Trump is hearing. And we know from the Washington establishment what kind of message he's going to hear. So I don't anticipate that Trump would do anything in the immediate future. But if, say, Yoon succeeds in rousing his base into violent action, I wouldn't be surprised if Trump ended up backing them if it looked like they were going to on the verge of succeeding. But again, it's all speculation, which who knows?
Mm-hmm. So one more quick question, Greg. Why do you think, obviously you wanted to really provoke a war, at least some kind of a local war with North Korea, and to justify martial law. So basically, a lot of some Koreans think that basically he failed. That's why, as last resort, he did go ahead and declare martial law. Why do you think North Korea not respond to Yoon's provocation?
That's an interesting question. I imagine they have their own intelligence gathering capabilities, just like the United States and other countries, and they probably were picking up information that South Korea was attempting to provoke some kind of conflict, and so they were just that considerable provocation from Yoon's military, to say the least. So that's my guess, is that they were picking up on information that there was a deliberate attempt to provoke them into a conflict, and they weren't naming part of it.
Indeed. And another thing I also did hear that is also now that Russia was U.S. And North Korea and Russia was having closer relationship with North Korea can also look to Russia, not just focusing on this side. So the same question, KJ, what would you tell to Koreans?
I think it's hard to say. What is clear on the extreme right that is supporting Yoon Suk-yeol is that they're trying very deliberately to appeal to Trump. They're wearing red MAGA hats. They're using the language of stop the steal because they're alleging that the election was stolen in the electoral, for the legislative elections. And there's a very, very clear attempt to appeal to Trump. Now, whether Trump will go for that remains to be seen. I think that Trump and Yoon probably will not get on with each other simply because Yoon is, I think, not the kind of character that Trump likes. I think that what we are seeing has the character of a violent color revolution that the US is trying to initiate in Korea in order to keep Yoon, or at least a Yoon-type character, in power, because Yoon is essential for the maintenance of US hegemony, in particular, the maintenance of preparations for war against China, which are essential for maintaining US hegemony. And so I think there's a very powerful institutional momentum that will try to keep Yoon in power, or Yoon's party, certainly Yoon's party or Yoon clone, in power. I think that they will try very, very hard to create a Ukraine type situation. When I say Ukraine, like Ukraine in 2014. And you can see that there's also been outreach to Manafort, which we don't know how close Trump is to Manafort at this time, but there has been outreach to him. At the same time, we also know that Kurt Campbell and Blinken have come to Korea specifically to, talk to, the South Korean national security state and to assure them that, quote unquote, the relationship is ironclad. So I think at the current moment, there are many factors in play right now. I think what is clear is that Trump is not necessarily anti-war per se, but he is neo-mercantilist. He is a businessman. He is about quid pro quo. He has threatened to raise South Korea's burden sharing for the privilege of being militarily occupied by 9-fold. And the South Korean military rapidly concluded a burden sharing agreement before Trump could get into power, because they didn't want that huge, inflation of costs 9 times to $10 billion. But I think Trump is not anti-war, but he's opposed to losing wars. And hopefully he understands that a war with China would be the most losing proposition of all time. And if that's the case, then there is a possibility for some de-escalation. And also we can recall that Trump actually made overtures to North Korea to de-escalate. So there are some possibilities, but at this moment, I think there are warring factions, and it's anybody's guess what will come out on top.
Indeed. So I guess to summarize from both of you, there's not going to be major difference, change in the way the United States, U.S. policy Indo-Pacific plan, and as part of the war against China, and so no major drastic change in policy. And in fact, at this point, again, the message that I wanted to get across is the Koreans are criticizing the U.S. interference in this current situation. And if United States continue to try to influence the Korea's domestic affairs, such as by supporting, favoring far-right politicians, there's going to be an anti-American sentiment, which we had very strongly in 1980s. So those people who are working right now in the progressive groups are demanding that U.S. stop interfering, U.S. stop favoring these far-right groups, and so that's the message that I am hearing from people in Korea, and that they are truly wanted to fundamentally new, more autonomous and independent policy. And they're saying that we are going to decide this impeachment process, not the United States. And so that's the message that I really wanted to get across. Now, let me see that the United keep there.
Simone?
Yeah.
Just a quick comment. I think the thing that lets us know that the US is so deeply implicated in this is the fact that the South Korean right, Yoon Suk-yeol's followers, are directly replicating US tropes about China. They're repeating, they're saying that they're saying that China has been interfering in South Korea's politics, when actually the accusation is a confession. It's the US which has been interfering in South Korea's politics since, 1945. And if the people waving American flags is not a clear indication, then simply the fact that a lot of this disinformation is coming through US social media channels also lets you know that, they could easily shut it down, but they're letting it propagate. I think that once again implicates the United States in very, very profound ways.
And thank you for that comment. Now, there's a question: does the United States try to keep their meddling unseen? That's one question. There's also other people who are saying that United States taking advantage of that Korea's current ongoing insurrection crisis to strengthen its control. So I guess maybe at this point, again, thanks so much for all of you, and also for excellent, superb analysis from KJ and Greg. Now, I would like to give the last words, have Greg and KJ to anything to add or respond to. If you look at the comments on the chat box, if you wanted to respond to any of them, and to some kind of takeaway message that all of us can for not only for us and also for our activists in Korea and also in the United States. Greg, do you want to have any last word? Wisdom. Wise words.
Wisdom, but last words anyways. It's been clear that for the United States, there's only one goal, and that's to maintain a solid tripartite military alliance between the United States, Japan, and South Korea, targeting not only North Korea, but China. I mean, all the messages coming out of Washington were along those lines, and all the visits by U.S. officials were along those lines. So I think the United States doesn't really care what the outcome is for the domestic South Korean population, as long as there's no change in that military alliance, and whoever's in power knows how to take orders, is very obedient for implementing U.S. wishes. So we've already seen in the past, when South Korea was under military rule, that didn't adversely impact U.S. relations whatsoever. We also know the cases of Pinochet's Chile or Suharto's Indonesia. No amount of repression would put off a U.S. embrace, as long as they were playing the role in an international scene that the U.S. wanted them to play. I do feel encouraged by the resistance of the Korean people to this attempt at a military dictatorship, and I don't think they're going to give up. It's going to be a very difficult fight, especially since Yoon's inciting resistance among the right-wing segment of the population. But I do believe that South Korea is going to prevail in keeping its democracy intact. Of course, I don't see much hope in the immediate future for extricating itself from the alliance with the United States, but if they can at least extricate themselves from the threat of military dictatorship, that will be a huge victory.
Thank you, Greg. And KJ, any last word?
Well, I agree with Greg, and I'm cautiously optimistic, but I would say that we are not out of the woods yet. There are going to be more twists and turns in this tale before we know the final outcome. Of course, it will be good if South Korea can avoid becoming a military dictatorship again, as it was for a large part of its existence. But I would say that without sovereignty, you don't really have democracy. So until South Korea really gets real sovereignty, starting with the recuperation of operational control over its own military, South Korea's quote unquote democracy, whatever form it takes on, will be really kind of a shadow of what it should and could be. Regarding Elliot's questions about does the US try to keep their meddling unseen, it's both yes and no. There's much of dog whistling but it's done underneath, the table. They're sending messages, covert messages, and they're also trying to send the message that, we're not doing anything at the same time that they are. What I am most afraid of is that this escalation to war has its own inexorable momentum. It's been building up since 2011, and we're getting very, very closer to the dates that have been calendared for war, most likely in the South China Sea, on Taiwan Island, or on the Korean Peninsula. 2027 to 2030 is the expected date. As we get closer and closer to war, we have to understand that war between superpowers most likely will involve nuclear weapons. The talk in Washington throughout the entire policy class is that they need to seamlessly integrate nuclear warfare into their war doctrine, exercises, and planning. And so any war with China, with Russia, could very easily go nuclear because, as Norman Finkelstein says, they are planning to nuke China. And then the other thing on the way to that dreadful outcome is that it's very conceivable that many countries could revert to dictatorship in time of war and in time of extremely unpopular war. A dictatorship is probably the easiest form of vassal state that you want. And you see this. We dodged a bullet in Korea, but I would argue that we're already seeing this in the Philippines, which is moving swiftly towards extraordinary violence, very, very close to the type of dictatorship that it had in the 70s. And we're also seeing signals of it on Taiwan Island, which is the other place where there could be war. So I would watch out for the reinstitution of dictatorships in Asia. And for God's sake, I hope that we can avert a war, but I believe that it's incumbent upon everybody to do everything humanly possible to prevent further escalation.
Indeed. Thank you very much, KJ. I just wanted to relate to your comment. I just reading from a Korean analyst, and who said that, in fact, according to his view, it's the Biden administration's actually tried to revive Yoon Suk-yeol, regime by successfully establishing martial law. As DC was the impeachment crisis, as martial law was actually this a sign of U.S. losing its hegemony. So in other words, what's happening right now is actually it's as much as it sounds like it was related to Korea, but it's also about something U.S. Losing its hegemony, and they thought it's at the end of the effect is the South Korea. So truly very precarious situation, but nevertheless, I think that I also hope, and that with today's our very detailed, comprehensive, very analytical, serious discussion, I hope that this help us to understand, not only understand, but also to empower us, and also to reach out to to our friends and colleagues and comrades and friends all over the world to fight together and to persevere, and also hopefully to become triumphant as well. So thank you so much for everyone. And I did have some images about the resistance, the Koreans who are fighting protesters, but I think I don't have time for that, but I will add in our when we edit the webinar, I will add that so that we can share. This again, I thank you so much, JNC TV Hyun, who has been. This is an amazing internet based in the United States, Korean Americans and Koreans who are grassroots organization and who report. It's very unique media. I hope that you can subscribe to their YouTube so that we can support their cause. And thanks so much for all of us for sharing your time and insight and knowledge. And thank you, special thanks to Greg and the KJ. And we'll pause here. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you, Simone.